Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Michael Spence, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, also former dean of the Graduate School of Business, and the author of a number of books recently. We've got this book called The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multispeed World, and also this other book, which I only have a digital copy. It's called Permacrisis, A Plan to Fix a Fragmented World. Welcome, Mike.
Nice to be with you, Greg. Thank you for having me.
Now, look, long before you were writing these books on global economics, in other words, before you became what someone I think you referred to as a former economist,
Right.
Back in the days when you were doing applied micro theory, you were known, and certainly known to almost anybody in the economics field, as the person who really put signaling on the map. And of course, now, there are, hundreds of thousands of works in the signaling literature. But I wanted to kind of ask you, when you go back in time, right, to when you were in graduate school, as someone who went to graduate school maybe 20 years later, I just am so jealous of what you were able to experience, because it seemed like a really exciting moment, right, in the evolution of economics. You had this, you're working with people like Ken Arrow and Dick Zeckhauser and Tom Schelling. And you said, I think at some point, maybe in your Nobel talk, that the reason why this was such an exciting time was that there were things that you could observe in the world, right, in industrial organization. There was this whole literature and structure and performance. You had Chandler and all the other folks there at Harvard as well. But there was really no theoretical kind of explanation for what was going on. And you guys were at the mind face sort of creating this. And then I think you're in grad school when George Akerlof's article came out on lemons. And you said this was sort of like a bolt of lightning, right? And so I was wondering if you could go back and just sort of revisit those times and, talk about how it is that the economics profession, when it's at its best, creates theories that help us to understand the world. In other words, there is some implicit understanding that practitioners have, but they don't have the theoretical foundations. And why is it so important that we have the theoretical foundations?
Well, I'm happy to do that. Einstein said, if you don't have a theory, you can't see anything, right? We all look at the world through lenses. We're starting to realize that now with these advances in technology and artificial intelligence and neuroscience, right? Animals see the world, but they see something different, right? Their sensors are different and so on. So I think at some level, a conceptual framework of some kind, we call it different things in different fields, is an important, way of seeing the world. Now, the advantage is you can see something. The disadvantage is you may miss something, depending on which framework you're using. But to go back to economics, we came through a period in the early post-war period with a lot of very talented people who were asking interesting and important questions. Ken Arrow was a central figure along with Samuelson and Gerard de Boer and many others, but they had a leadership role in bringing rigor to the kind of basic model, general equilibrium model of economics. And so that was just a major achievement. And then, somewhere along, and Schelling, was doing something completely different, had a very unusual, gifted ability to kind of see things using analogies and really was the architect, or one of the more important architects, of the conceptual framework that allowed us to get through the Cold War. Sort of how do you deal with an adversary? Is it sometimes an advantage to appear to be crazy, etc.? Lots of interesting things that are still relevant today. But what happened about that time is that, the people in industrial organization who were focused mainly on sort of, what determines the way competition works. A group of people, and I guess, George and Joe and I were among them, sort of looked at markets and said, well, it's fine to teach price theory, with the assumptions that we make. There isn't anybody with a huge amount of market power. Everybody knows everything they really need to know in order to function effectively in the markets and so on. Didn't correspond with reality very well. That doesn't mean that it's the wrong way to teach it. You do have to kind of understand how basic, markets work in terms of prices and supply and demand and incentives. A very important thing that Milton Friedman kept reminding us of is if you're doing anything, including formulating policy and ignoring incentives, you're probably going to, get it wrong. So we started paying attention to the structural features of markets that weren't in the intermediate price theory models. I guess the exception to that, Greg, would be there were models, of oligopoly, duopoly, and so on. And Demsetz had models of product differentiation, but they didn't really capture, the whole thing. So what happened, in more general terms, was that, people set out to sort of say, well, these are the structural characteristics of markets that we see in the real world, in finance, in consumer markets, in industrial markets, and so on. And we should try to understand how those structural features determine the way the markets work, both descriptively and prescriptively. So I ended up, for accidental reasons that I'm happy to recount, as a graduate student, getting interested in this sort of the fact that markets have pretty interesting informational structural characteristics. The buyers don't know as much as the sellers. There are informational gaps, there's informational asymmetries, etc. And Joe, did the same thing, and George was the one who illuminated, I think, in a way that got everybody's attention, the adverse selection problem. So the adverse selection problem was known in insurance, in the insurance world. I mean, the insurance people knew that, when you have a distribution of risk, if the low risk people know they're low risk and you price the insurance product to reflect the average risk, the low risk people may decide that's pretty expensive and leave. And if they do leave, they'll select themselves out of the market. And that's where the term adverse selection comes from. It's selecting in and out of the market, and it's adverse because the best risks leave first. What George did is establish that has a fairly devastating effect on market performance. And furthermore, it can actually destroy a market, make it impossible to have it sustained in equilibrium. So I thought to myself, that's pretty interesting. And Dick Zeckhauser and I had talked about that in the context of insurance anyway. The other interesting sort of informational asymmetry-related problem in insurance is called moral hazard, which is a term that everybody hears all the time now because of the impact of policies that are designed to protect people in cases of extreme risk, causing them to take the risks in more excessively. And that also came from insurance, right? So you give people a certain kind of protection against either, property damage or, health. They may behave in such a way, depending on the context, in which they elevate the risk that the adverse events will happen. So I was thinking about this, and Lester Thoreau, the late Lester Thoreau, very, very talented economist, came down to give a talk at the newly created Kennedy School faculty seminar, where I was the rapporteur at Ken Arrow's request. But as an aside, Ken Arrow always thought that if I had any distinctive abilities, it was as a rapporteur, which is taking, a relatively unstructured discussion, which is always the discussion you have in a seminar, and turning it into something that looked like was fairly coherent. It used to take me a week to produce these things. But anyway.
That probably helped you as dean.
Probably, it might have helped a little bit. maybe a little bit in terms of exposition, but anyway, Les came down and said there's something called statistical discrimination, which is a very basic point. So, to use the more modern terminology, if you have a distribution of product characteristics that are unseen on the buying side, then you essentially what you've done is you've taken potential this product differentiation and eliminated it because you can't see it, right? If you can't see it, you can't make it a part of the way the market works. And so that's very common, not just in insurance, all over the place. And so he said that gives rise to, so you get what is called a pooling equilibrium, right? If the market doesn't self-destruct on the Akerlof, model, then you basically got a bunch of different entities, with different characteristics, for sale in the market, and they're pooled because of the informational gap. And he said that gives rise to just statistical discrimination, meaning the people at the upper, if they haven't left the market, the people at the upper end of this distribution, are faring worse than they would in a world of perfect information. And the people at the bottom end of the distribution are faring better because they're being treated as the average. I mean, to put it, in rough and ready terms. And I thought to myself, well, that's an interesting point, right? He was actually talking about discrimination in the sense we mean it, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, etc. But that was a kind of that was what he was interested in. But the underlying theoretical point was the pooling equilibrium point. And I thought, well, that can't be the whole story. And there must be things that markets are pretty creative things. And so there must be something that goes on in markets that has to do with an attempt to transmit information or overcome the negative effects of these asymmetrical informational gaps. So that's what led me to signaling. So, I started asking myself the question, is there anything, that the high-end, sellers, think of it as a quality distribution, can do to distinguish themselves, reintroduce product differentiation? What Joe did was it's the flip side of the same coin. Is there anything the buyers can do to get the sellers to sort themselves out? Yeah, and that's called screening, right? So it's the same idea depending on who's taking the action. And that led me to this question. Well, I guess the core of the signaling model is it has to be visible. It has to cost something, otherwise everybody would do it. And the costs have to be negatively correlated with the quality. Otherwise, it won't survive in equilibrium. I mean, there's lots of interesting characteristics. For example, the beliefs, if you intersect that cycle, you start with buyer beliefs, and that determines a set of offers essentially in the market. And that determines what you might call investment behavior on the other side, which turns out to be the signaling behavior. Depends on the context, whether you call it investment or not. In the job market, it's investing in education and whatnot. So then what closes that loop is there's post-transaction, there's subsequent discovery. Otherwise, the whole thing's just free-floating, right? You can have any set of beliefs, who cares what they are? They determine behavior, but nothing. So anyway, post-transaction, there's discovery. And then there's a question, does that data disconfirm in any way the initial beliefs that produced the investment behavior? And when the answer is no, you're in equilibrium. So, and there's two ways that can happen. It can positively confirm them, right? Be consistent, or you could have no data whatsoever, in which case they're not disconfirmed, and that turns out to be kind of interesting, because if those beliefs cause certain people to exit the market, then you won't have any disconfirming beliefs. Even if you could force them into the market, they would be disconfirming. So those beliefs are essentially, they're true at one level and self-fulfilling at a different level. And the other interesting thing in my kind of peculiar history was because I had studied mathematics at Oxford just before getting to Harvard. I had studied differential equations. And so the description in the continuous model of the signal equilibrium is it's a first order nonlinear differential equation. So once I saw that, I knew what all its properties were, because I'd studied differential equations. So they had multiple solutions, they don't cross, etc. And those turn out to be interesting from the point of view of welfare, because some of those equilibria are kind of uniformly better than others, and so on. But that was the origin of it. Joe, I wasn't with him when he was doing screening, but must have been a vaguely similar process. And at a more general level, now stop here. If you have these informational gaps and they're perceived to be adverse with respect to market performance, there are several ways of closing them. One is signaling or screening, and that is now infiltrated into contract theory and all kinds of things. And people are right when they describe this as a kind of a part of applied game theory, right? In a sense. And so there's a fair amount of work in game theory and auctions and other things that pay attention to informational structure and who knows what, and when. But you can close these informational gaps with regulation. Like we have disclosure regulations that are probably pretty important in financial markets and other markets. And what that does is just change the incentive structure with respect to what you tell the other side of the market. And then the other important element, that I think is continued to be significant, including in the world of mega platforms and e-commerce and so on, is you can have informational intermediaries. You have people or entities that are there in the market more continuously than the ultimate buyers and sellers, and they are or can build a reputation for being trusted, and that does have the effect of closing informational gap. A good example of that is that most of the payments, the digital payment systems that we see around the world, had their origin in trying to solve the trust problem with e-commerce platforms, right? So in the early days of e-commerce, the problem was the buyers didn't think they were going to get the goods and the sellers didn't think they were going to get the money. And these payment systems were originally set up as a kind of, escrow system, just like in real estate transactions. And they evolved, because they had digital origins. But the friend of mine who was at one point the chief strategist for Ant Financial told me, when I first met him, he took me on a tour of Ant Financial. It was created to help Alibaba with the trust problem. And so he told me this story, which was essentially, was an escrow thing. And then he said, now, this is a pretty high-tech firm, with early advances in artificial intelligence and, using data to lend money to people who were otherwise anonymous in the system. And he said, do you know what the technology was that we used in the late 1990s when we first started? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, we used the fax. Incredible. Yeah. I mean, when you see an Ant Financial, 20 years later, it's hard to imagine using fax machines but anyway, that's what they did.
Well, look, I mean, there's no area of economics where you're not going to be talking about signaling and screening, whether it's labor economics or corporate finance or marketing. And
right.
even in core micro now, I mean, we have it baked in, at least in the business school. But when I teach it in game theory, and I even have this thing called the education game, which is based right on your job market signaling paper, which the students go through, and it helps them understand why they're getting their MBAs in the first place.
Right.
But when I teach it, I actually spend probably at least as much time talking about the biological models, right, of animal communication.
Right.
And so, John Maynard Smith and so forth. And so I'm wondering, looking back when you were developing these models, did you have any dialogue with the folks in biology? When
Well,
when did
I
these two
dialogue.
strands converge?
Oh, the way back. I mean, this was Schelling. He had me reading everything. John Maynard Smith. He had me reading Urban Goffman and sociology. I mean, this is a good example of these things came from different disciplines because they were part of what people wanted to try to understand. So there's a lively literature both before and after these formal models of signaling and screening in sociology, for example, and in biology, etc. Yeah. So, but I think it was all coming together at a time. At the time, it wasn't. You're right. It's a useful way of seeing what it's about, because it turns out it's not just about markets, unless you define markets pretty broadly. I mean, Schelling had me read something. I've been trying to find it recently. That the question was, how does a young man signal that he's really, attached to somebody, as opposed to, if he wants to marry them? And one answer, apparently there's an example of this, is the young man basically camps outside the house of the intended spouse. And the ones who last the longest are deemed to have, suffered enough to convey the depth of their affection.
Before engagement rings, right?
Yes, before engagement. Yeah, so there's the money version of it, and the I wrote a paper. There was a little in the one of the journals that was based at Harvard at the time. There was a set of papers having to do with time. It turns out time is an incredibly important signal, right? In just ordinary interaction, right? If somebody's willing to spend time with you, and we all just take this for granted, but it's because it's part of life, right? If they won't spend time with you, that sends a different signal. I mean, in the internet era, I think most people understand that the scarcest commodity is attention, right? Not money, not other things. And so the battle for people's attention or time or whatever you want to, be just slightly different, but it's pretty important. So it's all there. Yeah, but it did have origins well before the signaling and screening work.
This is, of course, why you sometimes want to make people wait in line, or you want to make people write long emails, or you may want them to do things which seem to be wasteful. Yeah. And if we were to try and measure, so I know in the transaction cost literature, there's all these attempts to try to measure what percent of the economy is spent on transaction costs, and we could try to measure how much of the economy is devoted to signaling. But one would think that with the rise of information technology, with all of the new tools that we have for getting access to information, that we wouldn't have to invest as much in signaling. And yet, no matter how you define it, it seems like we're investing more and more. It's taking up a bigger and bigger chunk of our economy, particularly if we think of education as one of the main signaling expenditures. How do we explain that?
I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that. I mean, just to sort of level set it, I mean, I do think the internet has dramatically reduced the cost of acquiring information of a certain kind, and has transformed many things. I mean, and it's even closed some of these informational gaps. So you can find out things about diseases that, where you were totally reliant on your family physician in the old days. You can find out things about products. You can do price search much more efficiently, and so on. So at some level, there's a set of dimensions in which there's been a pretty big transformation that we kind of all know about. But having said that, I mean, one of the things that I find hard to understand in the American context. This is, but to elaborate on this, education side of this thing is, it appears that over time, the desperate attempts to get into the elite universities, both public and private, including yours, has become extreme. Prepping kids as they come out of kindergarten to start to
Right.
get. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. I think it, and it's
I don't think it's an
particularly
exaggeration. It's a real phenomenon.
it's a real phenomenon. And I find it appalling that the kids aren't allowed to be kids, for a fairly large chunk of their pre-college time. But from an economic point of view, you start wondering, what are the benefits of this? I know that networks matter. And so you wouldn't want to dismiss the benefits of, having a Berkeley or a Stanford degree or any one of a number of others. But when I look at American higher education, there's this, very long list of top flight public and private institutions, and we all have friends who have done extraordinary things in multiple walks of life, who didn't go to, any of the top 10. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, and so it doesn't, at some level, it doesn't make any sense. So something's gone wrong, and I haven't figured it out. I don't understand why this is going on. But we ran into it in New York at one point. We were thinking of moving there. My daughter, who's a kind of trilingual kid who grew up in Italy, was exposed to this, intense private school sort of screening stuff. I mean, 13-year-olds were writing DEI statements. I mean, I'm not anti-DEI in suitable forms, but meaning the I includes everybody. But she looked at me and said, "What's that?" So there's something, that I don't profess to understand. On the more general point, I think it's true that there is still terribly important kind of private information. And so in a world in which there's huge payoffs to getting into, I don't know what to call them, at certain levels or in certain clubs, the fact that people go to extraordinary lengths to maximize probability that they end up in that kind of place, or position, it probably isn't surprising. Even if it's overdone, at least in the context I described before. I should tell you one story. When one of the first visits I made is, either I was a graduate student or just after, was to Chicago, and it started out being fairly unpleasant because, of course, human capital came out of the University of Chicago in the hands of a great economist, Gary Becker, and a number of other top flight scholars there. And they thought this was an attempt to dislodge human capital. So it was a pretty unfriendly seminar until I said, look, right, this is just math, but you don't have to get rid of human capital to have signaling. It's just changes, it's an add-on to the return to getting an education. So once they got the idea that you didn't have to choose between the models, but I have to say, people like, it's either this or that in a kind of deeply psychological way, and tend to go down that road regardless. Maybe people like controversy, I don't know. But from a mathematical point of view, you can just build the model with human capital in it and put the signaling effect in, and it doesn't change anything.
Well, look, I mean, you're most famous for your claims about education, and I think they've been simplified, right? I mean, because clearly education, there is a selection element and there's a treatment element, right?
Yeah.
And the big debate is, what are the ratios?
Right.
And obviously a crude simplification would be to say it's all selection. And I have some colleagues who actually say that, the ones that are kind of, I guess, disillusioned with their teaching.
Got it.
But I mean, as someone who's was an administrator and a professor for many years, it's very difficult to get up in front of the applicants and the donors and the parents and so forth and say, yeah, it's all selection. And once we admit you, our job is done. But I'm wondering, I mean, to what extent, what is the ratio? I mean, as someone who's been a dean, I mean, what do you think it is? And is this ratio shifting over time? And you also said that to the extent that it's signaling, there's a deadweight loss, and maybe, we should tax the signaling. But to the extent that it's treatment and that it's enhancing human capital, might be worthy of subsidy. And yet, if you need a subsidy for the one and the tax for the other, I mean, are we over investing in education, or under investing in education? How would we even know?
That's a very hard, I mean, empirically, that's a hard thing to sort out, right? Because if you think about this, the way the signaling model works, or the kind of real world analog, you don't actually have to know when you're investing in education what fraction of the return is enhanced human capital and what fraction,
Sure, but from a social welfare perspective.
No, but
right?
From a social welfare perspective, it makes a very big difference. And distinguishing you have to have a massive amount of counterfactual data in order to distinguish the signaling effect from the human capital effect. As I think the simplest way to say it, or to put it differently, if you in the world of experimental economics or social science, you'd have to take some people, out of the elite. You have to take somebody who's potentially a top flight engineer, not allow them to go to MIT, and then give them an education that's comparable in all dimensions, right? Not just faculty, but peer interactions and everything else. And that doesn't mean that distinction doesn't exist, but it's not terribly easy to get at it in an empirical sense. Probably,
So,
Steve Levitt or somebody could find a natural experiment that illuminates this, at least in some context. So, but I'm not sure what it would be.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, it seems clear that we are leaning on the subsidy side, right? So if we look at higher education in the United States, we have the availability of all sorts of, student loans, and there's government grants. And if someone were to propose taxing, higher education, and particularly, having a progressive taxation, so that, if you go to Stanford GSB, not only do you have to pay your $150,000 tuition, but you have to pay $150,000 tax on top of it, right? I mean,
right.
There would be very, very little support for that. But the theory seems to suggest that if it is mostly signaling, tax might make sense.
Yes. No, there's no question. If you optimize, it turns out if you take, look, I don't want to get stuck in the world of models, but if you just take the model and optimize, then you get what you just described, and it's exactly the same schedule, but at a different level that a monopolist would set as well. And not surprisingly, the monopolist doesn't want to waste stuff; he just wants to extract the surplus. And so that's fairly easy to demonstrate using optimal control theory or calculus of variations or whatever you want to call it. But no, I mean, on the kind of practicalities of higher education, I mean, in a sense, there is an element of this. So in I don't know how it's going to go in the future, because there's all kinds of legal interventions coming, but for the most of my life in higher education, there was an implicit tax system in, charging the full amount for relatively well-to-do families and using at least some of the proceeds, complemented by donations, to subsidize some other folks. So there was an attempt to adjust for ability to pay in the admissions process. It as I say, now it's, as you well know, it's being moved around a little bit by kind of legal interventions. I'm not saying they're wrong. I mean, but it looks like legacies are going to go away, even though that was part of the financial model, and things that we're trying to deal with, elements of past discrimination or differential opportunities. Those seem to be being scrutinized, pretty effectively now. So I don't know what the outcome's going to be. But I mean, the other fact that strikes me about higher education is that it's become very expensive. I mean, if you look at the consumer components of a consumer price index, there's sort of a competition between healthcare and, higher education in terms of, the inflation rate, to put it bluntly.
Well, it's become more expensive, but the ROI is continuing to increase, right? If you look at the gaps between the lifetime income of college graduates versus high school graduates, I mean, that's widened by even, more than the expenditure gap, right?
Yep, and it's probably true. Those things are not unrelated. But that may be true because, of the things that lots of people have talked about, like skill bias, technical change, and things that have, moved the income and other distributions around in our economy. And I think one important thing to say about that is, those things are structural conditions on a broader front, but they're not necessarily permanent, right? So the first round of digital adoption was probably not probably, almost surely, thanks to research at MIT and other places, it was a factor in job and income polarization. Seems to have taken out more middle class jobs. The question that's being asked now, and I don't think we know the answer yet, is the current round, powered by artificial intelligence and so on, going to do the same thing? I don't think so. But because it has a kind of different footprint. But the general pattern is correct, which is there is a high payoff to graduating with a top flight degree, getting into the jobs that are needed.
Well, look, we know that when screening becomes easier, then the need for signaling expenditure goes down, right? Like, I mean, if we have really good inspectors for used cars, then we don't need as many warranties.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, in the job market, I mean, are there? I mean, it seems like there would be a huge opportunity for anyone that would be able to evaluate competencies in people without having to expend all these resources on signaling. I mean, do you see the emergence of maybe some tools that will help us? I mean, I think Google said at one point, oh, we don't really care if you went to a top university. We're going to just, run you through these interviews. And if you can do this, then boom, we're going to hire you. And yet we haven't really seen a whole lot of that. It hasn't really dented in any way the investment that we make in educational signaling. Right. So, I mean, is that opportunity still there? I mean, what would it take? What would we need to do that?
The opportunity is for sure there, right? Because you could, if you increase the efficiency, you can find a way to distribute the benefits, and you might even get broader social benefits. Look, there have been attempts to do that, and so far they haven't been very successful. These are attempts, to do the screening more effectively and at lower cost. Closely related to that is the kind of work that Al Roth is associated with, is to improve the matching process, which one of the most sophisticated things that happens in the market is the matching process. You have differentiated tastes on one side and differentiated products or services on the other side, and you sort of want to match them up. And you can say the same thing about the job market, right? So it's not true that somebody is permanently better at everything than somebody else. It's partly a matching problem, and there's been a lot of progress in some areas on dealing with matching problems and algorithms and incentive structures and so on that deal with that. So I don't mean but when it comes to, kind of some broad-based technology that allows markets to function, kind of across the board more efficiently in this respect, I don't think we're there yet. But, Eddie Lazier once had a company that was trying to do this, the late Eddie Lazier, good friend of mine. And it was well conceived, but, ultimately, I don't think we really solved the problem. My daughter was involved at one point in a startup that was attempting to do something similar. And I think it's just that it's a hard problem to solve, and we haven't solved it yet.
Okay, just before we resume, are you using the microphone from the headphones in your ears?
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, it was just clicking a little bit. I don't know what that was.
Oh no, I don't know why.
But if you weren't hearing it, then that's okay, I guess, because
I haven't heard any clicking, and
okay.
the computer shows that. Well, it's talking in my ear. I can put the other one in actually, make sure there's no. Sometimes my dog walks through, but let me see. How's that?
That's good. Okay. So maybe we can transition and talk about your life as a former economist, right?
Yeah, they're right. Yeah.
I mean, I think
there
to a lot
are
of
less
people,
polite terms for that. The late economist. Anyway.
well, I think to a lot of people who know your work as an applied microtheorist, they might be surprised to know that you are doing so much around global economic issues. But this is not something that you turned to as so many Nobel laureates do, right? Where they sort of just pontificate about things. I mean, you've always been deeply interested in issues of growth and prosperity and of global coordination and so forth. And so, you've devoted most of the last 20 years to this, and you've done work with the World Bank and other organizations. And I one of the things that I really struck me when you were talking about the permacrisis was the need for cognitive diversity within these global economic bodies. I mean, a lot of people talk about the Washington Consensus, and I think oftentimes that's spoken of as, isn't it great? Everybody agrees. And I think you're saying maybe that's the problem, that everybody agrees. So to what extent can someone with your background kind of help stimulate cognitive diversity within this consensus?
No, I think it takes multiple, batches of experience. So this is the experience I've had in the last 20 years. So the formative thing for me, this is accidental. I don't know the history, but I decided I'd contributed enough under the heading academic administration at the end of the 90s. Business school was about to have its 75th anniversary. I thought my successor ought to preside over that. We raised a little bit of money to try to make that transition easy. But it was, it was the internet bubble, right? And so I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And it has to do with information. So I kind of went back at that. And then, we were investing, and some of Garth Saloner and I taught a course on e-commerce. There were some pretty nutty ideas for businesses, in addition to overvaluations. I think if you fast forward to today, we probably got some overvaluations, but the business models seem less nutty than they were, at that time. But in the middle of that, I got a call from out of the blue, from the World Bank, specifically the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management organization within the World Bank. It's got a new name now, I think, or it's been reorganized. But anyway, and they said, would you give a lecture on growth to our annual meeting in the spring? And I said, why me? Right. I don't know anything. I'm not in development economics. You have 10,000 of the most knowledgeable people about development there. What is are you setting me up or something? And they said, no. it was that they said, you know something about microeconomics, you know something about investment, you know something about incentives, and we think growth has slipped away from the international agenda in favor of other things. So I said to myself, I didn't tell them this at that time, I said, this is a screening device. I said, there's two outcomes here to simplify a bit. One of them is I do this and it's a disaster, and then I'll know that's not what I should be doing for the next few years, assuming I stay healthy. But the other one is that, isn't a disaster and maybe it'll turn into something interesting. So it turned out it was the second, and they thought it was interesting. And that's where the Growth Commission came from. And so what I discovered in that is that people, very talented people with all kinds of different backgrounds, need to kind of talk to each other and learn from each other in order to kind of make progress. So, I was Bob Solo was on that commission. So we had the godfather of growth theory. And we had 2 or 3 people from a business background, but most of these were policy and political leaders, current and past, who had, dealt with complexity, fought battles, won some, lost some, and they were willing to talk to each other with the right spirit. That we formulated our own mission statement, and it was, let's see what we've learned in the 15 years since the Washington Consensus was promulgated. That's without being critical of the Washington Consensus. This wasn't, let's get rid of that thing. And see if we can formulate it in a way that's easy to understand and helps the next generation of leaders in the developing world. And so that's what we set out to do. It's not for me to judge how well we did it, but I had enormous amount of respect for those folks. And there was Mantak Ahluwalia in India, was with Manmohan Singh for most of his journey. Joshua Schwab was the head of the central bank in China. Goh Chok Tong was with Lee Kuan Yew, a pretty important person in the development of Singapore and a good chunk of, East Asia, etc. So, I won't try to list them all. And so I think that at some very basic level, the notion that you can learn from each other and from the experience in a wide range of countries. And what I found when we started that, Greg, is that I remember a very good friend named Roberto Zaga. He was at the World Bank at the time. He was the secretary to the commission. We just worked very closely together on that. Danny Leipziger was the vice chairman. He had a real daytime job at the World Bank as well, whereas Roberto was seconded. And he went on to be the head of the World Bank in India under Bob Zoellick before retiring. So I asked him, he's an interesting background. He was born in Cairo, and like everybody else under, in the early days in Egypt, they were all kicked out, and a lot of them ended up in Latin America. He grew up in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and so the extended family was in Argentina and Brazil. And so he knew Latin America very well. And a lot of the Washington Consensus came from experience in Latin America. So I asked him, I said, because I had, for accidental reasons, learned a fair amount about Asia. So I said, Roberto, how many people in the World Bank could give a coherent 5-minute presentation on what's going on in China? And he said, very few. I said, why? And they said, well, they're all, they're either focused on Africa or Latin America, or there's a few of them focused on Asia, etc. It was siloed. And that is dysfunctional. And I ran into the same thing. I remember, when I learned in China, for example, that they would set objectives that they hoped were realistic and then find a way to get there. As opposed to sort of learn from the rest of the world what the right policies are, and then the outcome is whatever comes from adopting the right policies. This is very, to me, very fundamental. The question is, what are the objectives? And, and in Latin America, the objective was much closer to let's get the policies right. And I asked people, and when I visited as part of the Growth Commission work, I said, which of these models is the right one to adopt? Get the policies right, and then the outcomes or whatever they are. And Latin America tended to be get the policies right, and Asia tended to be this is where we want to go, but we don't know how to get there, but we're going to figure it out over time. And it gives rise to very different behavior. I think the world's much better now. In precisely this respect, there's a widespread, understanding that you need to learn from the experience, the innovations, and so on from a wide range of countries, and that's and so that's healthy. I found that in China. I don't know if it's still true in China now because it's more slightly xenophobic than it used to be under the previous administrations. But, I was part of a small group that was helping advise on the 12 5-year plan, and was one of the earlier 5-year plans, back in the 2010 era. And people would say, what's your role? And I'd say, well, the Chinese are very curious about what happened in Japan and what happened in Brazil and why did Brazil grow quickly and then stop and all that. Just as part of their, formulating their own strategies. If so, they had us positioned in the right place, right? And they were using this. I think that's much more common now. I mean, you get, policy people and leaders from Africa visiting Asia to learn what they can there. And it's not because, you can paste the solution in one place onto another. It's that they're, it's kind of like academia. You get ideas. Some of them, can be adapted and made useful and so on. So one of the nice things that's happened in the world is that it's this notion that, the extreme version of it is, I asked people, again, in Latin America, I don't mean to be excessively critical because I think there's wonderful people doing wonderful things there, entrepreneurs and other things. But I said, is there anything useful you can learn from the Asian experience? And they said, absolutely not. So that's the old days. That's the thing I think that's kind of disappeared for the benefit of everybody.
Well, look, the world of science and academia, we're always debating the optimal amount of specialization, right? We're always thinking about, okay, how do you develop expertise within a discipline, and then how do you connect across disciplines? And in the world of policy, it seems like there haven't been these explicit discussions about the optimal organization of these policy organizations. You talk a bit about how the Federal Reserve, in particular, became very sort of inward looking, and then achieved these blind spots, right? That prevented them from seeing what was really going on with inflation, maybe prevented them from seeing what's going on back with 2007, 2008. And so do we need to kind of be more explicit about the institutional design to think carefully about knowledge dissemination in policy circles, both kind of domestically and internationally?
Yeah, I think we do. This is the things you're talking about that come out of the book. This I agree with them, but I think it's Mohammed talking. So I think you.
Mohammed El-Arian, your co-author.
Yeah, exactly, Mohammed El-Arian. And it's kind of his world, kind of the global finance and whatnot. But I think it's right. We all have, regardless of our kind of academic backgrounds, have run into experiences. The one I remember the best was IBM was completely dominant at one point in the computer industry and almost lost and had to be transformed as an organization. And one of the reasons that scholars who studied that think they almost lost it was their view of the world was determined by talking to each other as opposed to people outside, right? And so while to use Andy Grove's term, while the industry went from vertically integrated to horizontally structured, they kind of almost, reacted too late to that. And so in general, and I think there are other examples of that, right? You probably get a version of it in Washington, where people are sort of talking to each other, and if they get isolated, they'll miss important things that are going on, whether they're in the way people perceive the world, or what new opportunities there are, in all kinds of dimensions. So I think the fundamental insight is right, which is you don't want to spend all your time, kind of collecting stuff from all over the world. But you don't want to spend all your time talking to, the 10 people you think actually know what's going on, and not talking to somebody else. I remember, I'm trying to remember the age, but the governor of the Bank of England during the GFC, good guy. Came to taught at NYU. I'm sorry. I'll think of his name in a minute. He said one day a week he would go and just leave, Threadneedle Street, and go around and talk to people in various parts of the economy in Britain, just to figure out what was going on. I think that's really an intelligent thing to do. And so I think it should be elevated to a general principle. Derek Bach once asked me, he was the president of Harvard when I became the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He said, "Where do you think innovation comes from?" I said, "I don't have any idea, but other than creative minds." But it seems like one of the stimulants is when people, you get innovation at the kind of boundaries between two disciplines that are related to each other, but looking at the world in different ways. And I think there are lots of examples of that. So I think that's not a whole answer to the question, but it's a partial answer. And it's similar to what we're talking about here, right? I mean, you get, you refresh your ideas, you refresh your understanding of the world, you get a new way of seeing things if you devote at least a subset of the time to going outside the world that you live in normally, including in academia. So when young people ask me how do they structure their education, I say, well, you're bound at the graduate level to have to go deep. I mean, there's no alternative. You just want to reserve a certain amount of time to be, outside the narrow area that you're focused on.
I think it was Mervyn King you're talking about.
Mervyn King. It's Mervyn King. It's correct. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, look, when I think about these two books, the book Next Convergence seems very optimistic, right? And it talks about this elimination of poverty and the prospects of inclusive growth and so forth. But then when we turn to the more recent book, the Permacrisis, I mean, there's a bit of a alarmism.
Backsliding.
Look, I mean,
more than a bit, right?
So, and the argument is that crises are becoming ever more frequent. And I mean, and there's a lot of people that say that too. How do we know if that's just sort of a subjective sensation that is driven by our exposure to news or our sensitivity to these things and awareness of what's happening in the world? And to what extent can we, objectively measure the extent to which our systems are incapable of dealing with the uncertainty of the world?
It's a very good question that not many people ask, I might add. So I'll give you 100 points for that one. Because, it's a question that I think we have to ask ourselves, which is that we are exposed to just a massive amount of information that we weren't exposed to before. And so just psychologically, we could have the sense with relatively little change in the world, that
right now there's a big fire in Los Angeles.
Sure.
So people all around the world are like texting me, "Are you all right?" It's like, well, I'm not even anywhere near Los Angeles.
That's right.
But 100 years ago, no one would even have known until maybe a month later that there was a fire if they ever found out about it.
Yeah, so I don't think I don't have a precise answer to that, but I think the the way I approach that is try to look at the big challenges. You know, maintaining some reasonable level of global sort of interdependence with the benefits that it brings. Without getting into big trouble, dealing with the various dimensions of the sustainability agenda. Dealing with sort of stunningly high levels of inequality, uh, especially in wealth. And Thomas Piketty's right. There's long cycles in these things, and maybe you just have to live through them. Um, but the last thing I did is I looked at the St. Louis Fed publishes pretty detailed data on the American household net worth, assets, liabilities, and net worth. The the Let's see, the top 10% has 2/3 of the net worth. The bottom 50% has 3%. Yeah, sort of wonder, can you really run a society that looks like that for indefinitely? And if not, what's going to break and cause it to change? My friend Dave Brady, you know, has been uh, has been convinced by some of the literature that says you need an enormous shock to change the trajectory, the kinds of shock that you get from a major war and so on. I don't know if that's true. Bob Putnam says, there are bottom up kind of mechanisms that he tries to document that, suggest you can change direction, without kind of going through those shocks. I don't have the wisdom to sort those things out. So when I look at those things, and then try to say, well, yeah, we know more about them. We hear about them all the time. So maybe we're fooling ourselves a little bit. But in the end, Greg, I kind of come to the conclusion, I'm not saying I don't know. When you live in a world in which, you have a black plague and a famine every now and then, and people are living pretty close to the margin, in terms of subsistence and whatnot, and that's what preoccupies them every day. Is this world more hazardous or risky or something than that? I don't know. Maybe not, right? Uh, but this one feels like it's in the dimensions that we and other people have tried to talk about. Seems to be, uh, at least challenging, without claiming that it's kind of, totally different or, than it was 50, 100, 150 years ago.
Well,
But so I think, frankly speaking, if you have a third of Pakistan underwater, and things like that, it's kind of hard to dismiss that there's something fairly fundamental that needs to be addressed.
well, I mean, if you were to extrapolate the trends that were happening at the time when you first joined, say, the World Bank, I mean, it would have been hard to forecast the kind of fragmentation that we're seeing now. And you spent a lot of time in the new book talking about this fragmentation and
Yeah.
the bifurcation. I mean, we're kind of dividing into a world of, the U.S. dominated world and the China dominated world, which might include Russia now and Iran, some other countries. I mean, do you think this is a blip, a speed bump on the way to the continuation of globalization and increasing prosperity?
No, I don't. I mean, I think it's a fundamental change. I mean, so it's various ways to get at it, but go back 25, 30 years. Most of the developing world was not a middle income country at that point. And now most of them are. Not all, and it's just right to worry about the ones that are relatively poor and defenseless. But that, the developing world is kind of a big place now, much more resilient. If the United States decides to kind of go its own nationalist way, the there's a fairly big part of the world that, can build something. It won't be as good as, if we all do it together, but it's not catastrophic. It's not pleasant. President-elect Trump slaps tariffs on a bunch of places, but the point is, the world is a completely different place, and it's not going to revert. I don't think. There'll be trust issues, potential conflicts in terms of power, and so on. This is multipolar, whatever. I mean, there's lots of terms that have been invented to use this, but the, center of gravity of the global economy is slipped to Asia. That's kind of a permanent change. All of the interesting markets were in what we call the developed countries. That's not true anymore, etc. So I think the way to think about it, the way we thought about it is, it's not a useful exercise to try to go back where we were. It worked for a long time. It was pretty benign. I still think, one of the largest exercises in inclusiveness is the growth of the developing countries in the post-war period. And I don't think that's permanently truncated, but in international interaction, the exercise is building a new thing or a significantly altered thing that's fit for purpose and realistic about the tensions, realistic about the, risks that are as they're perceived by various places. And that's not an easy exercise. We didn't pretend to have done it. I mean, I don't think anybody with any humility would say they know how to do that. It's the best we can do, I think, at this point is try to move in the right direction, mini steps in the right direction. So that's permanent. I don't think the climate things are just going to sort of vanish. We're going to have to find a way to live in it in a different world, and it'll be a rocky, bumpy journey. At least I don't see any kind of way to make it kind of simple and easy. There's no silver bullet solutions. When I wrote the Next Convergence, I did write something for my friends in Singapore. What did we? I wrote two things, actually. I'll mention them. I wrote something for the Journal of Economic Literature, and in a symposium kind of thing on the Washington Consensus. Because you mentioned it before, I'll just go back to that. The Washington Consensus was actually a pretty reasonable summary. I mean, John Williamson was a smart guy. And when you look at what it was actually did, it was the problem with the Washington Consensus. It was hijacked by the people who thought you could simplify it to, sort of liberalize, privatize, and that kind of thing. And that simplified version of it, I think, demonstrably was not ideal. But I think the main thing that Washington Consensus didn't have in it was a kind of sense of the experiences and learning that occurred in Asia, in the Asia development stories. I tried to write about that, but when I wrote the Next Convergence, there were some things I saw and things I didn't see. I tried to summarize them for the Singapore people. I did not see the semi-collapse or fragmentation. So I thought the convergence process would be largely a function of whether countries could get organized and take advantage of this asset, which is the global system, right? Trade, goods and services, capital flows.
LPGO.
Yeah, like all that kind of thing. And so I think the developing world can survive that, except for the low-income countries. I think they're in real danger because it's a less benign external environment. Nobody at some level particularly cares. And the pandemic used up their fiscal resources, and climate is knocking them all over the place. It's just really, kind of, I didn't see that coming. And I didn't see the I mean, we had the digital era, but we certainly didn't see the enormous power of, artificial intelligence. So a part of that book that we haven't talked about is, we got some pretty powerful tools to do pretty good things if we decide to use them well.
Well, the key thing
In
is that all those tools are coming out of your old stomping ground, right,
right,
in the Bay
right,
Area. And I remember when I was in grad school that everyone was talking about the rise of Japan and how it was going to eclipse the
yeah, that's
U.S.
right, that's
20
right,
years later, it was the rise of China, and it was
yeah,
going to eclipse the U.S. And we talk about the multipolar world and
yeah.
so forth. But I mean, at the end of the day, all of the innovation, I mean, big chunk of it is still happening in the U.S. And as I like to tell my Italian friends, and now that you're an Italian, I can tell you, right? Nvidia's market cap is bigger than in Italy plus Germany's market cap. So, as somebody who is now moved away from Silicon Valley and who lives abroad, and you have sort of an outsider perspective, are the Silicon Valley people drinking too much Kool-Aid to think that it is still the capital of innovation, and that there's really not that much to fear from these other centers of innovation?
I would, yes and no. Right, it is still, some significant amount the center, and so they're not wrong about that. Some of the more alert ones are also aware that there's a fair amount of talent scattered around the world, and they find a way to take advantage of it. I mean, they get caught in the tensions, right? So Sequoia is a pretty big important player in Asia, including China, but they had to kind of face the reality of the tensions and kind of split it up. So now you've got two powerhouses instead of one. I mean, it's the no. The yes part is it's still by orders of magnitude ahead. The second part is not alone anymore. I mean, the way I describe it to people is, when I was not that much younger, but I'd say 20 years ago, you could count on the fingers of one hand the places that were likely to produce stunning innovations, especially in digital. Um, that's not true anymore, right? I mean, you got entrepreneurial activity, you got unicorns being built. China's a powerhouse in multiple dimensions of science and technology, including digital. No, the unfortunate thing is they used to talk to each other, and now they can't anymore, right? They're just completely bifurcated, or fairly completely bifurcated, and that's not ideal, but probably inevitable. And because the other thing I think it's important to say is that because there's always been dual use technologies. The question is, how big a footprint do they have, and how many restrictions do you have to put in? And for a long time, these dual use technologies came from the defense and the military side, and then found applications in the commercial world. But it's kind of flipped over, right? And now we have really powerful things like artificial intelligence that were developed for whatever reason by scientists, technologists, and for downstream commercial purposes that turn out to be pretty important militarily and in national defense and national security. And so those intrusions into the normal process of developing and deploying technologies in markets and other places is been intercepted essentially by the national security agendas of various places. Yeah, so the bottom line is, I think there's no threat to Silicon Valley, in terms of, competition. But there are other places that are good enough to be, factors in the way the world works, especially China. But, Europe is an interesting case. I mean, Mario Draghi wrote a report that was published in the early fall that, is a kind of wake-up call for Europe in this dimension. Europe has a ton of talent, right? It's just they've got a bunch of other stuff that's getting in the way. And so they're falling behind in ways that adversely affect the potential of the economies here. I mean, if it were just digital and, you could isolate it, you could say, well, we're not going to catch up with Silicon Valley or the United States or even China. The problem is that these technologies are going to be the underpinning of kind of major structural transformations of, kind of everything, right? The whole economy, the industrial economy, et cetera. And the science and technologies, I guess. And so that you do not want to be, it's not completely isolated from, it's more, you don't want to be just the consumers of that. You want to be part of the process of creating it. And you want to do it in part because you want to keep talented people in your neck of the woods. So to take the Italian example, I mean, there are lots of Italians who have dreams that are similar to the young folks in Silicon Valley, but many of them, not all, but many of them have to leave to pursue those dreams. And that's not, you just don't want to, when to my Italian friends, I say, we just don't want our most important export to be the creative younger people. And
yeah, we've actually, here in San Francisco, there's an Italian innovation hub, and it hosts Italian entrepreneurs and investors, and they come through all the time, and a lot of them wind up staying.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, listen, Mike, thanks.
No, I was just going to say the Draghi report is an attempt to kind of, it was done at the request of the European Commission, and maybe, with a little bit of, a stimulus from the American side under President-elect Trump's policies, we'll start investing more and effectively in some of these things. I think it would be beneficial for everybody if Europe, became over time. I mean, we're talking about, at least a decade, a kind of major contributor to all of this, in addition to China and the United States. But we'll see. The jury's out on this right now.
Well, let's hope that Europe can learn from America's dynamism, and America can learn from the Europeans in terms of quality of life.
Yeah, and social
Mike,
protections. Yeah,
exactly. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining me. The two books are Permacrisis and The Next Convergence. And of course, we all hope that many of the things that you predict are actually good predictions. And of course, we also hope that some of those predictions are bad predictions.
That's fair enough.
But I appreciate you joining me. And we'll talk again soon.
Oh, it's so great. Thanks. It was really a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.